The morning sun filtered through tall windows of the county courthouse, casting sharp beams of light across the polished wooden benches. The building itself carried a history of countless trials, murders, thefts, betrayals, and reconciliations. Yet on this day, something about the air felt different. The courthouse was unusually crowded, every seat filled with townspeople, reporters scribbling in notepads, and families whispering quietly as they waited for the proceedings to begin. The case on the docket was, at first glance, an ordinary burglary trial. A man accused of breaking into a suburban home was to face justice. Burglary cases rarely drew much public interest, yet the presence of a child witness, just 3 years old, had stirred curiosity and concern. Court officials had tried to keep the detail quiet, but word had leaked, and the thought of such a young child being part of a legal process brought people out in droves. The judge entered the courtroom promptly at 9, his black robe flowing as he took his seat at the bench. His gavel struck once, silencing the scattered murmurs. The tension was tangible, a heavy blanket draped over the room. Lawyers shifted stacks of papers on their desks, preparing their strategies, while jurors adjusted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what the day would hold. From the back, the bailiff opened the heavy oak doors. The sound echoed across the chamber, drawing every eye toward the entrance. Stepping inside was a young mother, her posture tense, her hand holding tightly to the small figure beside her. The child, barely tall enough to reach her waist, clung to her fingers as though they were his lifeline. His wide brown eyes scanned the sea of strangers, his tiny frame stiff with fear. The boy's shoes made soft tapping sounds against the tiled floor, each step hesitant, as if he might retreat at any moment. His mother leaned down, whispering encouragement that only he could hear. Her words, though inaudible, were filled with a mother's desperate hope that her son would find enough courage to endure what lay ahead. The spectators leaned forward. Some softened, their expressions melting at the sight of such innocence in a place built for conflict. Others frowned, skeptical of whether a child so young should be placed in such a setting. Reporters scribbled frantically, sensing that whatever unfolded here would be a story worth telling. The child did not yet know what testimony was, nor the weight of truth and lies within a courtroom. What he understood was much simpler. Strange people frightened him, loud voices unsettled him, and the memory of that night, the burglary, still clung to him in the form of shadows and nightmares. His mother guided him to a seat near the witness stand, close enough for him to be seen but not directly in the spotlight. The prosecutor watched intently, his jaw tight, as if silently calculating how best to handle the delicate situation. Across the room, the defense attorney leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp, observing every detail. The judge cleared his throat, addressing the court with measured authority. "This is an unusual circumstance," he said. "We ask for patience and understanding as we proceed." His gaze swept the room before settling briefly on the boy. For a moment, his stern face softened, revealing a flicker of humanity beneath the robe. The courtroom buzzed again, low whispers bouncing off the walls. The boy shrank against his mother, overwhelmed by the sound. His tiny fists clutched her sleeve so tightly that his knuckles turned white. She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, whispering again, but his eyes darted nervously toward the benches, scanning the faces of strangers staring back at him. The bailiff, sensing the child's unease, quietly stepped aside. A signal was given and a second door opened. In walked Rex, the police department's K-9 officer. Normally known for patrols and high-risk operations, today his role was different. He had been trained as a comfort companion for vulnerable witnesses, particularly children. His dark coat gleamed under the overhead lights, and his calm demeanor immediately contrasted with the rigid formality of the room. Rex padded forward, his nails clicking softly against the floor. The boy's eyes widened, momentarily distracted from his fear. The dog stopped a few feet away, lowering himself into a patient sit, ears perked but body relaxed. He was waiting for the boy to make the first move. A ripple of murmurs passed through the courtroom again, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. "Proceed," the judge said, though even he seemed curious about how the interaction would unfold. The boy stared at Rex, uncertain. His mother leaned down once more, whispering, "He's here to help you." Her words were tender but firm, her voice carrying the weight of a parent determined to shield her child from fear. The boy hesitated, glancing at the lawyers, the judge, the reporters, and finally back at the dog. His lips pressed together, his small chest rising and falling rapidly. He shifted closer to his mother, unwilling to step forward, yet unable to tear his gaze away from Rex's steady eyes. The dog, trained to sense hesitation, responded with a subtle movement. He lowered his head slightly, a gesture of trust and patience, his tail swishing once across the polished floor. It was as though he were saying, "I am here. You are safe." The boy's hand twitched, his fingers flexing as though tempted to reach out. For a brief second, his fear loosened, replaced by the fragile beginnings of curiosity. The room, filled with adults hardened by years of legal battles and heavy truths, seemed to hold its collective breath. They had witnessed dramatic cross-examinations, shocking confessions, and fierce arguments, but none of it carried the fragile suspense of this moment. A 3-year-old boy deciding whether to trust a dog in a courtroom. The silence stretched long enough for even the ticking of the courtroom clock to sound loud. The boy's breathing slowed slightly, his shoulders easing a fraction. His mother gave the smallest nod, encouraging without pushing. Finally, with a trembling motion, the boy leaned forward, extending his tiny fingers toward Rex. The dog remained still, allowing the hand to hover just above his fur before finally making contact. The boy's touch was hesitant, feather-light at first, then firmer as he felt the warmth beneath his palm. For the first time since entering the courtroom, a faint flicker of calm spread across his face. His lips curved upward, a shy, fleeting smile that seemed almost out of place in the solemn chamber. Gasps and murmurs echoed softly again, quickly suppressed, but not before the boy noticed. His smile faltered, and he pulled his hand back slightly. Rex responded instantly, pressing his head gently against the child's knee, grounding him once more. The boy's smile returned, this time steadier. The prosecutor exhaled, his relief barely concealed. The defense attorney scribbled notes furiously, though his expression betrayed a hint of admiration for the dog's quiet influence. Even the judge leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the boy with newfound patience. What had begun as a day of routine testimony now carried the spark of something extraordinary. No evidence had yet been presented, no witness had spoken, and no verdict loomed near. Yet the courtroom had already shifted. The boy's presence, once feared to be a liability, was transforming the atmosphere into something human, fragile, and profoundly real. For the first time that morning, the trial was no longer about documents and arguments. It was about courage. And everyone sensed that this small, trembling child and the loyal dog by his side would leave behind a moment that no verdict could overshadow. The boy sat beside his mother, his small hand still resting cautiously near Rex's fur. The courtroom had settled into a fragile rhythm after the child's hesitant first touch of the dog. Yet beneath the surface, tension lingered. Everyone knew why he was there. He was not a spectator, nor a mere symbol of innocence. He was the key witness to a crime that had shaken his neighborhood, and his presence, though tender, carried weight far heavier than any child his age should bear. 3 months earlier, his quiet suburban street had been pierced by the sound of shattering glass. 2 masked men had forced entry into the family's home, ransacking rooms for valuables. The boy's father was away at work, and his mother, hearing the commotion, had scooped him up and hidden him in his bedroom closet. From that dark corner, the boy had heard footsteps, muffled voices, and the harsh scrape of drawers being pulled open. He had clutched his stuffed bear to his chest, his heart thundering in his ears. Though the burglars fled before police arrived, one suspect had been identified and arrested days later. The case against him was strong fingerprints, stolen items recovered from his car, eyewitness accounts from neighbors. But the prosecution wanted every detail to land heavily with the jury. Even the presence of the child, the youngest victim of the crime, carried symbolic weight. And to the prosecutor, the boy represented not only evidence but also empathy, a living reminder of the human cost behind the burglary. But bringing a 3-year-old into court was controversial. Defense attorneys argued it was manipulative, a ploy to sway the jury through sympathy rather than facts. Psychologists debated whether the child could even process what was happening, and the mother herself wrestled with guilt each time she pictured her son sitting among strangers, facing questions he barely understood. Yet she also believed in the importance of truth. If her child's quiet courage could help secure justice, then perhaps the ordeal was not in vain. Now, inside the hushed courtroom, those debates collided with reality. The boy's presence was no longer an idea but a fact. He sat small and fragile in a room designed for adults. His dangling feet didn't reach the floor, and his head barely rose above the witness chair. The microphone loomed awkwardly near his mouth, too large and too close, as though it belonged to another world. The prosecutor rose slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. His voice, usually sharp in its precision, softened as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, we request to allow the child witness to remain present, accompanied by his mother and the support dog Rex." The defense attorney immediately pushed back his chair, rising with practiced urgency. "Objection, Your Honor. The boy is far too young to provide reliable testimony. His presence here risks prejudicing the jury, who may be swayed by emotion rather than fact." The judge raised a hand for silence. His eyes shifted between the attorneys, then settled briefly on the child. In that moment, the courtroom held its breath. Everyone waited to see whether the boy's presence would be deemed permissible, or whether this fragile experiment would end before it began. After a pause, the judge spoke. The child's testimony will be limited. We will not demand from him what he cannot reasonably provide. But his presence is relevant to understanding the events of that night. The objection is overruled. We proceed. A wave of murmurs swept through the benches, reporters scribbling furiously. The mother's hand tightened around her son's, her pulse racing. The boy looked up at her, confusion in his wide eyes. He didn't grasp the ruling or its significance. All he knew was that strangers were watching him, and the tall man in the robe had spoken words he didn't understand. Rex, sensing the spike of tension, shifted closer, resting his chin gently on the boy's lap. The child's fingers immediately found comfort in the coarse fur. A small smile flickered across his face, fleeting but genuine. That tiny smile did what no legal argument could. It reassured the spectators that perhaps, just perhaps, the boy could manage. The prosecutor stepped forward cautiously. He knew that a barrage of questions would only terrify the child. Instead, he began with something simple. "Hello," he said warmly, his voice steady but soft. "Do you like dogs?" The boy blinked at him, silent. Then his eyes drifted downward to Rex, whose tail swished once. With a shy nod, the boy's lips parted just enough to whisper, "Yes." A murmur rippled through the courtroom again, quickly hushed. It wasn't evidence. It wasn't testimony about the burglary. But it was a response, and that in itself was remarkable. The prosecutor smiled faintly. "And this is Rex. He's here to help you. You don't have to be afraid, okay?" The boy glanced at his mother, who nodded reassuringly. He leaned closer to the microphone, his tiny voice trembling but audible. "Okay." For the first time, the courtroom felt the weight of the child's courage. No legal textbook had prepared them for the significance of those two small words. The defense attorney rose again, frustration clear. "Your Honor, I renew my objection. These questions are irrelevant and only serve to draw sympathy." The judge sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Counselor, your objection is noted. However, I will allow some latitude in order to ensure the child feels comfortable. Proceed." The defense attorney sank back into his chair, lips pressed thin. He knew every word spoken by the child carried the potential to sway hearts, even if it lacked direct evidentiary value. Jurors were human after all, and humans responded to innocence. Meanwhile, the mother stroked her son's hair, whispering encouragement. The boy's small chest rose and fell with steady breaths, calmed by Rex's presence. For the first time he looked not at the floor but at the judge. His gaze was uncertain, but it held. The judge nodded gently. "You are very brave for being here," he said, his tone uncharacteristically tender. The boy tilted his head, considering the words. He didn't fully understand bravery, but he understood kindness in a voice. And so, with a tiny nod, he accepted the compliment. For the jurors, it was a turning point. In that moment, they weren't thinking of fingerprints or alibis or the technicalities of law. They were thinking of a child forced to hide in his closet on a night when strangers invaded his world. They were thinking of fear, innocence, and resilience. The facts of the case mattered, yes, but so did the story. The human story unfolding before their eyes. And so, as part two of the trial began, the boy's role was no longer in question. He had arrived not as a silent accessory, but as a living reminder of why justice mattered. The defense would fight, the prosecution would press, and the judge would guide. But already the child's presence had reshaped the atmosphere. He was the key witness, not in the sense of delivering airtight facts, but in reminding everyone that behind every crime stood real people whose lives were changed forever. And that reminder, unspoken yet powerful, was something no jury could ignore. Rex had been in courtrooms before, but never like this. Most days, the German shepherd's duties were centered on patrol, drug detection, or tracking suspects. His reputation within the department was legendary. Loyal, sharp, fearless. Yet behind his strong frame and alert eyes was another skill carefully cultivated through training. The ability to bring calm where fear lingered. Therapy duty wasn't his primary role, but when it mattered most, Rex knew how to be more than a guardian. He could be a friend. As the boy shifted uneasily in his seat, Rex lowered himself onto the polished floor, stretching his body close enough for the child to sense his warmth. His handler, Officer Daniels, gave a subtle nod of encouragement, then stepped back. This was Rex's moment, and Daniels knew better than to interfere. The boy glanced down, uncertain. He had seen dogs before, but never one this large. Rex's ears twitched, his eyes calm, his tail sweeping the ground in a slow, steady rhythm. There was no demand, no urgency, only patience. The prosecutor paused his questions, allowing the interaction to unfold. Even the judge, who usually insisted on strict order, leaned slightly forward. His stern expression softened. The jurors watched closely, some with the faintest smiles tugging at their lips. In that quiet moment, the case itself seemed to pause, giving way to something deeper than legal proceedings. The boy's mother squeezed his hand. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Rex is here for you." At first the boy remained still, his small chest rising and falling rapidly. But then Rex shifted closer, resting his chin gently on the boy's knee. The contact was feather-light, almost hesitant, as though Rex, too, sought permission. The boy froze, wide-eyed, then slowly, ever so slowly, let his hand drop onto the dog's fur. The room seemed to exhale as one. Reporters, pens paused mid-scratch, jurors leaned in, and even the defense attorney, who moments earlier had been ready to argue, fell silent. The boy's tiny fingers curled into Rex's coat, tentative at first, then firmer as he felt the steady heartbeat beneath the fur. For the child, that touch was an anchor. The courtroom, with its towering walls and intimidating strangers, had felt enormous and terrifying. But in Rex, he found something familiar. The warmth of a living creature, the steadiness of his breathing, and the gentle patience in his eyes told the boy one simple truth: he was not alone. Officer Daniels watched from a distance, pride swelling in his chest. He had trained Rex for years, teaching him commands, discipline, and loyalty. But no command had guided this moment. This was instinct, the deep, unspoken bond between dog and child. The prosecutor took a cautious step forward. "Do you like Rex?" he asked softly. The boy's lips parted. His voice was barely more than a whisper, but it carried clearly enough through the microphone. "Yes." A ripple of relief spread across the courtroom. The boy had spoken again, not about the crime, not about the fear, but about something safe. It was progress. The defense attorney leaned forward, frustration flashing in his eyes. "Your Honor, I must again object. This is irrelevant." "Overruled," the judge interrupted, his tone sharper than before. "The child is allowed to answer simple questions for his comfort. We will proceed." The defense attorney sank back, muttering under his breath, but his objection had been dismissed. The boy's connection with Rex had already shifted the balance in the room. The boy stroked Rex's fur again, his small fingers tangling slightly before releasing. A shy smile tugged at his lips, the kind of smile that seemed impossibly out of place in such a solemn chamber. Yet it brought light to the heavy air, reminding everyone present that trials were not only about punishment, but also about healing. The prosecutor, careful not to press too hard, asked gently, "Do you know why Rex is here?" The boy hesitated, glancing at his mother. She gave a small nod. Then he turned back toward the microphone, his voice trembling but audible. "To help me." The simplicity of the statement resonated deeply. For a child who had once hidden in a closet clutching a stuffed bear while strangers stormed his home, finding safety in a dog's presence was not just comfort, it was victory. From the benches, a reporter scribbled furiously, sensing the headline forming. A juror dabbed her eyes discreetly with a tissue, and the judge, usually stoic, shifted uncomfortably, as if fighting the pull of emotion himself. The boy leaned closer to Rex, whispering something inaudible to anyone else. Rex's ears twitched, and his tail gave a slow wag. The child's body visibly relaxed, his shoulders no longer curled tightly inward. His mother exhaled in relief, tears brimming in her eyes. She had spent sleepless nights worrying about this moment, fearful that the courtroom would break her son further. But now, watching him stroke Rex's fur, she realized something unexpected. Her son was stronger than she had dared to hope. The prosecutor, sensing the fragile trust, did not push further. He knew the real questioning would come later, if at all. For now, it was enough that the boy had spoken, enough that he had found a thread of courage. The judge cleared his throat. "We will take a short recess," he announced, his voice carrying across the room. "Court will reconvene in 20 minutes. The gavel struck once and the courtroom stirred. People rose, stretching, whispering about what they had just witnessed. The defense attorney muttered to his assistant, frustration evident, while the prosecutor allowed himself a brief sigh of relief. But in the corner, away from the noise, the boy knelt beside Rex, his hand still buried in the dog's fur. The bond was unshakable now, forged not by commands or training manuals, but by trust. As the benches emptied and reporters hurried outside to file updates, one truth lingered in the air. This trial would be remembered not for its arguments or verdicts, but for the unlikely support of a police dog who had reminded everyone of something greater than law, compassion. And though the boy was too young to understand legal battles or courtroom strategies, he understood this much. Rex made him feel safe. And in a world that had once terrified him, that was everything. The courtroom reconvened after the recess, and the atmosphere felt both lighter and heavier at once. Lighter because everyone had witnessed the small miracle of a boy's trust in Rex. He had spoken, smiled even, which gave the room a fragile sense of hope. Heavier because the real test was still ahead. Encouraging nods and whispered reassurances could only go so far. Eventually, the boy would face questions that reached closer to the night of the burglary, and that was where fear still lived. The judge rapped his gavel and chatter quieted instantly. Jurors returned to their seats, shuffling papers and avoiding one another's eyes. The prosecutor stood again, his shoulders squared, but his voice deliberately softened. He knew the stakes. A child's silence could be as telling as words, but it could also unravel the careful rhythm of a case. He glanced at Rex, lying calmly at the boy's side, and then at the boy himself, who sat clutching a small stuffed bear he'd been allowed to keep in his lap. "Would you like to tell us your name?" the prosecutor asked gently. The boy opened his mouth as if to speak, then froze. His gaze darted across the courtroom, jurors watching intently, reporters scribbling every flicker of his expression, strangers staring from the gallery. His throat tightened, and he buried his face against his mother's arm. A wave of discomfort rippled through the room. The prosecutor cleared his throat, forcing a calm expression. "That's all right," he said quickly. "You don't have to say it if you don't want to." The defense attorney smirked faintly, leaning back in his chair. To him, this was evidence of weakness in the prosecution's case. A witness who could not speak was no witness at all. He scribbled a note, already planning his argument for dismissal. The mother rubbed her son's back, whispering softly, "It's okay, sweetheart, you're safe." But the boy only pressed closer, his shoulders trembling. The sight tore at her, but she held steady. She knew forcing him would only push him deeper into silence. Rex stirred. With a soft huff, the dog shifted his weight and nudged the boy's leg with his nose. The movement startled the child, pulling his face away from his mother's sleeve. His wide eyes met Rex's calm gaze. The dog wagged his tail once, slow and steady. The boy hesitated, then reached down, burying his hand in Rex's fur. The tremor in his shoulders lessened. He took a shaky breath, his small chest rising and falling. But still no words came. The prosecutor tried again, careful not to push too far. "Can you tell us? Do you remember the night when Rex came to see you?" He deliberately shifted the framing, offering the boy a softer entry point. Rex instead of burglars, comfort instead of fear. The boy blinked, his lips moving soundlessly. He lowered his eyes, fiddling with the ear of his stuffed bear. His silence stretched long, filling the room with unease. Every second ticked by loudly in the quiet, the sound of the clock echoing against the walls. The defense attorney leaned forward. "Your Honor, I object to this line of questioning. The child is clearly unable to respond." The judge frowned, his gaze firm. "Counsel, he will answer if and when he chooses. Allow him the space." The objection was overruled, but the unease remained. The jurors exchanged subtle glances. Some appeared sympathetic, others skeptical. How much weight could they truly place on a child who could not, or would not speak? The boy clutched Rex, his silence now thick with meaning. Inside his mind, memories flashed. The sound of glass breaking, heavy boots on the floor, his mother's frantic whisper urging him to stay quiet. He remembered clutching his stuffed bear in the dark closet, listening to the strangers' voices. Fear clamped down on his throat now, just as it had then. To him, speaking felt dangerous, even if the danger was gone. The courtroom felt the weight of his struggle. Reporters paused their writing, transfixed by the quiet tension. The mother's eyes brimmed with tears, but she held her son firmly, whispering steady words of reassurance. The prosecutor stepped back slightly, recognizing that pressing further could break the fragile progress they'd made. "We'll pause here," he said softly, nodding to the judge. The judge inclined his head, appreciating the sensitivity. "Court will allow a moment." In that pause, something remarkable happened. Though the boy still said nothing, his silence spoke volumes. The jurors, watching him cling to Rex, could see the weight of trauma. They could see the way his small body curled inward, the way his eyes darted nervously. His silence was not defiance, it was fear. And fear, they understood, was real. The defense attorney, however, was quick to exploit it. Rising, he adjusted his tie. "Your Honor, with respect, the prosecution is asking this jury to interpret silence as testimony. This is improper and prejudicial. The boy's inability to answer should be seen for what it is: unreliability." Gasps stirred in the gallery. The mother stiffened, her protective instincts flaring. Rex let out a low rumble, not aggressive but warning, his loyalty clear. The boy pressed closer to him, burying his face in the dog's neck. The judge banged his gavel sharply. Order! Counselor, you will refrain from intimidating language. The child is not on trial here. His tone carried steel, silencing the defense attorney mid-rebuttal. The boy peeked up briefly, startled by the sound of the gavel, then looked at Rex again. The dog licked his cheek, and the child's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles. The room softened. Though he had not spoken, the image was powerful. A child who had endured fear, now finding comfort in a loyal dog's presence. The silence, once heavy with unease, now carried a different weight. It was evidence, not of facts but of impact. The prosecutor, recognizing the moment, let it stand. He didn't push further. Instead, he said quietly, "Thank you, that's all for now." The boy's head lifted slightly, surprised. No one was forcing him anymore. He relaxed into Rex's fur, the tension easing from his small frame. His silence had been accepted, respected. That in itself was healing. The jurors watched with softened eyes. They hadn't heard details of the burglary yet, but they didn't need to, not in this moment. What they had seen was enough to remind them that crime was not just about stolen objects. It was about stolen peace, stolen safety, stolen childhood moments that should never have been interrupted by fear. And so, though the boy spoke no words that day, his silence echoed louder than testimony. It became a symbol of the trial, a reminder that sometimes the absence of speech told the deepest truths. When the judge called for another recess, the spectators filed out quietly, their conversations hushed. No one wanted to break the spell of what they had witnessed. A child had not in the traditional sense, yet the courtroom had been changed all the same. For in his silent struggle they had seen innocence, fear, and the quiet resilience of a child who had endured too much. And perhaps in that silence, they had also seen justice in its truest form, not in words but in understanding. The air inside the courtroom still felt delicate, like glass that could shatter with the wrong touch. The boy's silence lingered in everyone's memory, yet so did the image of him pressed against Rex, drawing strength from the dog's steady presence. That image had softened jurors' expressions, and even the most hardened courtroom observers had felt their hearts stir. When court reconvened after the short break, the boy remained seated beside his mother. He didn't fidget as much now. His small hand rested loosely on Rex's back, fingers absently stroking the dog's fur as though the steady rhythm anchored him. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The prosecutor rose again, cautious but hopeful. He had learned not to rush the child, not to demand more than he could give. Instead, he took a gentler path. "I see Rex is keeping you company," he said, speaking not as a lawyer but as someone trying to meet the child where he was. "Does he make you feel safe?" For a long moment the boy did not respond. The courtroom held its breath. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. Just once, but it was enough to draw quiet murmurs from the gallery. The prosecutor smiled warmly. "I think Rex likes you too. He looks very happy sitting there." The boy peeked sideways at Rex, who wagged his tail lazily in agreement. A faint smile flickered across the child's face, gone as quickly as it appeared, but the room noticed. It was the first voluntary smile he had shown all day. Encouraged, the prosecutor carefully bridged the connection. "Would you like to tell Rex something?" The boy hesitated. His lips pressed together tightly, but his gaze shifted from the prosecutor to Rex. The dog tilted his head, ears pricked forward as though he were waiting. Slowly the boy leaned closer, his small hand gripping Rex's ear for balance. He whispered, almost inaudible, "Good dog." The words were soft, but the courtroom heard them. Silence followed, deeper than before, then broke into a collective hush of amazement. A child who had refused to speak to grown men in suits had found his voice for a dog. The boy's mother's eyes brimmed with tears. She squeezed her son's shoulder, overwhelmed with pride. He had spoken, not to the court, not to the prosecutor, but to Rex. And somehow that mattered more than any formal testimony could. The judge leaned forward slightly, his stern expression softened. "Let the record show," he said carefully, "that the witness has spoken." His words carried weight, not in a legal sense, but in a human one. He understood the importance of preserving that fragile moment of courage. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably. He tried to mask his frustration, but the jury had seen it too. His earlier arguments about unreliability felt cold compared to what they had just witnessed. He scribbled furiously on his legal pad, but his confidence had cracked. Meanwhile, Rex continued to anchor the boy. The dog gave a soft chuff, as though acknowledging the compliment, and leaned into the child's touch. The boy's fingers buried deeper into his fur, and his breathing steadied. He did not look around the courtroom anymore. His focus was squarely on Rex, the one presence that made him feel safe. The prosecutor knew not to push further into the night of the burglary just yet. Instead, he allowed the bond to grow. "I think Rex likes hearing your voice," he said gently. "Would you like to say it again?" The boy hesitated, then whispered once more, a little louder this time. "Good dog." The jurors smiled, some visibly moved. A few leaned back, wiping discreet tears from their eyes. It wasn't about the words themselves. It was about what they represented: courage, trust, a child reclaiming a piece of his voice in a room that had once terrified him. The mother exhaled slowly, her hand never leaving her son's shoulder. She had feared this day would overwhelm him, but watching him whisper to Rex was like watching the first rays of sunlight pierce through a storm. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. The story they had come for, the burglary trial, the legal arguments, was shifting before their eyes. They were witnessing something far more powerful: the healing power of connection, a boy's resilience, and a dog's unwavering loyalty. As the boy whispered a third time, slightly bolder now, Rex responded by licking his cheek. The child giggled, a soft, high-pitched sound that rang like music in the courtroom. The gallery erupted into smiles and muffled laughter. Even the judge, who rarely allowed emotion to sway the proceedings, couldn't hide the faint upturn of his lips. The prosecutor stepped back, satisfied. He had achieved what he needed, not in testimony but in proof of courage. He turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, I believe this is sufficient for today." The judge nodded, agreed. Then he turned to the boy, his voice gentle in a way few had ever heard inside that courtroom. "Young man, thank you for being very brave today." The boy didn't respond, but he leaned his head against Rex's shoulder, as though the dog had absorbed every word on his behalf. As the judge called for another recess, the courtroom buzzed with quiet awe. People filed out slower this time, reluctant to leave the atmosphere that had just unfolded. They knew they had witnessed something rare, something that would be remembered long after the trial's verdict was forgotten. The boy's connection with Rex had not just softened the jury. It had reminded everyone present, lawyers, reporters, strangers in the gallery, that justice was not only about laws and facts. It was about people, about humanity, about recognizing the courage it takes for a frightened child to find his voice again, even if only to say two simple words. That moment became the story whispered in hallways, replayed in news articles, and carried home by jurors who would tell their families about the little boy and the police dog who changed the mood of a courtroom. It was proof that connection could heal, that courage could grow in the smallest of gestures, and that sometimes justice arrived not in grand speeches, but in whispers meant for a loyal friend. For the boy, those whispers were more than just words. They were his first step back toward safety. And for everyone who heard them, they were unforgettable. The courtroom was still buzzing from the boy's soft whispers to Rex. "Good dog" had been spoken twice, then a third time with more strength, each repetition carrying an invisible weight that everyone felt. By the time the judge called the court back into session, the air felt charged, as if something extraordinary was waiting just beyond the edge of silence. The boy remained in his chair, his small hand never leaving Rex's thick fur. The stuffed bear still sat in his lap, but for the first time that day, it looked less like a shield and more like a companion. His shoulders were less hunched, his breathing steadier. His mother stroked his back, whispering encouragements that no one else could hear. When the judge gestured for the proceedings to continue, the prosecutor hesitated. He knew the boy had already given them more than anyone expected. Forcing him further could undo everything. But something in the boy's posture, a quiet bravery blooming in the shadow of fear, suggested there was more to come. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said softly, "with the court's permission, I'd like to ask just one more question." The judge studied the child for a long moment, then nodded. "Proceed, but keep it gentle." The prosecutor crouched slightly, lowering his voice to the boy's level. "Do you remember what Rex did the first time you met him?" The boy blinked, his gaze shifting to Rex. The dog wagged his tail, his tongue lolling in an almost goofy smile that seemed entirely at odds with the gravity of the room. The boy's lips twitched. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then leaned close to Rex's ear. Everyone leaned forward instinctively, straining to hear. "Good dog," he whispered again, but this time his voice was clearer, less tentative. The courtroom stilled. They had heard him before, but now there was something different in the way he said it. It wasn't just a whispered secret between a boy and his dog. It was an offering to the room, a statement of trust and safety spoken out loud. And then, just as the weight of that moment settled, the boy did something no one expected. He sat up, turned his head toward the judge, and repeated, louder this time, his small voice trembling but audible to everyone, "Good dog." The words were simple, childlike, but they rang through the courtroom like a bell. The silence that followed was electric, filled with shock, awe, and something more, hope. The jurors exchanged glances, many with tears in their eyes. Some clasped their hands tightly in front of them, moved by the courage it had taken for a 3-year-old to raise his voice in such a setting. The prosecutor swallowed hard, his own throat tight. He hadn't expected this, hadn't dared hope for it. Yet here it was, a breakthrough, fragile and powerful. The boy's mother covered her mouth with her hand, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. She pulled her son close, kissing the top of his head, whispering, "I'm so proud of you." Even the judge, whose role demanded impartiality, could not completely mask his emotion. He cleared his throat, his eyes softening as he leaned forward. "Thank you, young man," he said gravely. "Those are very important words." The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His earlier smugness was gone, replaced by unease. The jury had just witnessed something no cross-examination could undermine. A child's voice, small yet genuine, carried more weight than a dozen rehearsed arguments. Rex, sensing the significance of what had happened, responded with a gentle nudge and a lick to the boy's cheek. The child giggled, a clear, unguarded sound that rippled through the courtroom like sunlight breaking through clouds. That laughter, pure, unfiltered, was as powerful as any sworn testimony. The gallery erupted in hushed emotion. Reporters scribbled madly, their pens scratching furiously to capture every detail of the moment. Some spectators wiped their eyes, others clasped hands over their hearts. No one wanted to break the spell, yet everyone knew they had just witnessed something unforgettable. The prosecutor didn't press further. He knew better than to risk tarnishing the magic of that instant. He simply nodded, stepped back, and said, "No further questions, Your Honor." The judge inclined his head, his gavel resting untouched. "Court will recess," he declared, though his voice carried a gentleness not usually found in his rulings. As people began to shuffle out, the boy remained seated, still stroking Rex's fur. His small shoulders no longer shook with fear. His eyes, though tired, held a quiet pride. He had done it. He had spoken not just once but twice, in a room that had seemed too big, too loud, too terrifying. His mother hugged him tightly, her tears dampening his hair. "You were so brave," she whispered. "So very brave." The boy didn't respond, but he looked down at Rex and whispered again, "Just for the dog, good dog." And in that simple repetition, in those two tiny words, the boy reclaimed something that fear had stolen from him: his voice, his courage, and his place in the world as more than just a silent witness. For everyone who heard him, it was a moment that would linger, not because of legal strategy, not because of evidence or arguments, but because a child had stood at the heart of justice and found the strength to speak, guided by the steady loyalty of a dog. That was the moment people would remember long after verdicts were handed down, long after court transcripts were filed away. Two words spoken by a child had reminded an entire courtroom what courage truly looked like. The words still lingered in the air, two simple syllables, spoken by the smallest voice in the room. Good dog. No one could stop replaying them in their minds. For a courtroom used to transcripts, cross-examinations, and carefully phrased objections, the innocence of that moment hit harder than any prepared testimony. When the judge called the session back into order, the room felt transformed. People sat, their expressions softer, almost reverent. Even the clinking of pens against notepads sounded subdued, as if no one wanted to disturb the fragile courage that had just been revealed. The prosecutor knew he didn't need to push further. He had learned long ago that sometimes the strongest evidence wasn't in facts alone, but in humanity. So he returned quietly to his seat, leaving the boy and Rex at the center of attention. The defense attorney rose, his expression carefully neutral, but his hands betrayed his nerves as he adjusted his tie twice before speaking. He cleared his throat. "Ladies and of the jury," he began, his tone cool, "you must remember that while this moment may be touching, it is not testimony. Emotion cannot replace evidence." His words rang hollow. The jury listened, but their eyes strayed back to the child stroking Rex's fur. They weren't dismissing the law, but they were human beings first, and they had just seen raw truth in its form. No legal jargon could erase it. One juror, a middle-aged father of two, stared at the boy with glistening eyes. He thought of his own children and imagined them in the same position. Could he have asked them to face a courtroom full of strangers, to summon bravery out of fear? His heart clenched, and his decision began to solidify. Another juror, an older woman who had been skeptical earlier in the trial, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. She had lived through decades of hearings, disputes, and neighborly conflicts, but never had she seen courage so small and yet so mighty. The gallery whispered among themselves in hushed tones. Reporters compared notes, trying to capture the essence of what had just happened. They knew the story wasn't just about a burglary anymore. It was about resilience, the bond between a child and a dog, and the unexpected ways truth could shine through. Headlines were already forming in their minds. Child's two-word silence courtroom. Police dog inspires bravery in young witness. The judge noticed the ripple of emotions and raised his gavel lightly, though he didn't strike it. Instead, he let the silence linger. He wanted everyone to feel the gravity of the moment. "This court acknowledges," he finally said, his voice deliberate, "that courage comes in many forms. Today, we have seen it firsthand." The defense attorney shifted again, his composure cracking. He tried another angle. "Your Honor, if the boy is to be considered a witness, then surely his words must address the events of the night in question. Otherwise, what relevance do they hold?" The judge's gaze hardened, though his voice remained calm. "Counselor, relevance is not confined to direct recounts. Sometimes relevance lies in understanding trauma, fear, and recovery. The jury will consider what they have seen in their deliberations." The defense attorney sat down sharply, his jaw tight. He knew he was losing ground. Meanwhile, the boy's mother continued to hold him close, whispering encouragements. She had feared that bringing him here would scar him further. Instead, she saw healing in real time. the way he leaned into Rex with ease, the way his shoulders no longer shook under the weight of silence. Rex, for his part, simply remained steady. He didn't care about verdicts, arguments, or headlines. His role was simple: to be there, unwavering and loyal. And in doing so, he had accomplished what no attorney could. He had unlocked the courage within a child. As court resumed with technical matters, the reading of evidence, the calling of other witnesses, the boy's small act continued to echo. Jurors compared every new piece of testimony to what they had already seen. A child who had nothing to gain, no reason to fabricate, showing fear so real it needed no words. The prosecutor, though silent, knew the case had shifted. He no longer needed to prove the boy's reliability. The boy had already proven his humanity. And humanity, more than anything, moved juries. By the time court adjourned for the day, the gallery was abuzz. Reporters rushed to file their stories, some shaking their heads in disbelief. "I've covered trials for 20 years, one said, "and I've never seen anything like this." Another added, it wasn't about the crime anymore. It was about courage. Outside the courthouse, people spoke in clusters, replaying the moment. "Did you hear how he said it the second time? Louder, like he wanted us to hear. That dog, what an incredible animal. Imagine being only 3 and doing that in front of everyone." Inside, the boy rested against his mother's shoulder, exhausted but calm. Rex lay at his feet, eyes half closed, but his ears twitched every time the boy shifted. The bond between them had into something unbreakable. For the jurors, the unexpected impact was profound. They weren't just weighing burglary charges anymore. They were weighing what justice meant for a community, for a family, for a little boy who had found the courage to whisper 2 simple words. That evening, as the courthouse emptied and the reporters' headlines spread across newsrooms, one truth became clear. The boy's words had changed the trial. Not because they provided factual details, but because they reminded everyone that justice was about people, about fear, healing, and courage in its form. And so the story grew. It spread beyond the courthouse, beyond the city, reaching people who would never know the boy's name but would remember the lesson his voice had taught. Courage could be as small as 2 words whispered to a dog, and sometimes that was enough to move mountains. The courthouse steps were bathed in the late afternoon sun when the trial finally ended for the day. People streamed out in clusters, jurors escorted by deputies, reporters rushing to file their stories, and townspeople who had come simply to watch justice unfold. Yet despite the usual commotion that followed a high-profile case, the tone outside felt hushed, almost reverent. The moment inside when the boy had said, "Good dog," was still fresh, still echoing in hearts and minds. The boy and his mother left quietly through a side door, escorted by a court officer and accompanied, of course, by Rex. The child held tightly to his mother's hand, but his other hand never left Rex's fur. His small face looked tired, worn from the day's emotional weight, yet his eyes carried a lightness that hadn't been there that morning. He had spoken. He had found his courage, even if only in 2 simple words. His mother bent down as they reached their car, cupping his cheek gently. "I am so proud of you," she whispered again, pressing a kiss to his forehead. The boy nodded, leaning into Rex as the dog licked his hand. It wasn't the kind of victory most courtrooms were used to celebrating, but for this small family it was monumental. Inside the courthouse, conversation still revolved around the boy and Rex. One bailiff shook his head in wonder. "I've seen defendants confess, witnesses break down, but I've never seen anything move a room like that child did today." Another nodded, adding, "It's strange, isn't it? 2 words that had nothing to do with the crime, and yet they said everything that mattered." The jurors, back in their hotel rooms for the night, replayed the scene in silence. Some scribbled notes not about the burglary but about what they had felt. One juror wrote, "If courage is truth, then that child told us more than any adult witness could." News articles spread quickly. By evening, headlines blazed across websites and TV broadcasts. "Child witness finds voice for K9 partner. 3-year-old's words move court to tears, and good dog moment shifts tone of burglary trial. The story captured not just the legal community but the public's imagination. People who had never set foot in a courtroom felt the weight of those 2 words. For the defense, the moment had been a blow they hadn't anticipated. Their strategy relied on portraying the child as unreliable, too young to matter. But now, the jury had seen with their own eyes the very real fear and very real courage that defined him. No legal argument could erase that. The prosecutor, though cautious not to rely solely on emotion, recognized the shift. He knew he still had to present evidence, testimonies, and facts, but now the jury understood what was at stake. They weren't just deciding on stolen goods and broken windows. They were deciding on the safety of a community where children like this boy deserved to feel secure. And yet, beyond verdicts and legal strategies, the true story had already been written in hearts. It wasn't about the burglary anymore. It was about a small boy who found his voice in a courtroom full of strangers, guided by the loyalty of a dog. In the weeks that followed, the trial continued and eventually concluded. The defendant was found guilty, but long after the verdict was read and the sentence handed down, people remembered something else entirely. They remembered the boy's whisper. They remembered how silence turned into courage. They remembered Rex's wagging tail and steady presence at the boy's side. Years later, those who had been present would still tell the story. Some jurors would recount it to their, describing how a little boy had changed the way they saw justice. Reporters would reflect on it as one of the most moving moments of their careers. Even the judge, long retired, would mention it in quiet conversations, admitting it had been one of the rare times the law had felt less like procedure and more like humanity. As for the boy, he grew older and stronger, his memories of that terrifying night fading into the background of his childhood. What remained sharp, however, was the memory of Rex, the dog who had given him courage when he needed it most. For him, good dog was more than praise. It was a declaration that he was no longer powerless, that even in his smallest voice he had something worth saying. Rex continued his service as a K9, but he was remembered not just as a tracker or protector. He became a symbol of comfort in the community. Children who saw him at events would run to pet him. Parents would thank the officers who brought him, and many would whisper that they had heard the story. Rex, the dog who had turned a courtroom into a place of healing. And so the memory endured, not in the legal record which reduced it to a simple note about a child speaking, not in the official transcripts where "good dog" appeared without context, but in the hearts of all who witnessed it, where the weight of those two words would never fade. The lasting memory wasn't just of a child and a dog. It was of what they taught an entire courtroom. That justice is not only about laws and verdicts, but about humanity, compassion, and the courage to speak when silence feels safer. That day, a frightened 3-year-old reminded everyone that courage doesn't have to be loud or long. Sometimes it's just 2 words, whispered in trust, echoing far beyond the walls where they were spoken. And in that simple, unforgettable moment, the boy and Rex left behind a legacy of hope that would outlive the trial, the headlines, and even the years themselves.